Okay, good morning, everyone. Or if you're watching this video later in the day, good afternoon or good evening. It is a lovely 5 degrees out today in Binghamton, New York, and we're all freezing. You can see the background here is very different than it has been in previous lectures because I have to come upstairs because my children are home today due to wind chill. Things have changed drastically since I was a kid. If it was 5 degrees, you went to school no matter what. -20 wind chill, you went to school. So my children are home today. They're downstairs with their father. But so today, the agenda is to Room 19 by Doris Lessing. It's funny because I was thinking this morning, and after reading some of your discussion posts, we have this trend in this class somehow of kind of edging toward, suicide. Everything is the theme for this course seems to be kind of like moving towards suicide or as a theme, but that's not what the course was intended to be. But we did study Virginia Woolf, who didn't write necessarily about too much despair in the same way that we saw in To Room 19, or some of you are referencing Sylvia Plath or Sylvia Plath's poetry if you've read it. But, ultimately she was in a lot of despair, which led to her suicide, which led to Sylvia Plath's suicide. Some of you, one person, it might have been Alyssa. I'm trying to remember who compared this to The Bell Jar, if you've ever read that novel by Sylvia Plath. And to kind of frame this for you, The Bell Jar was actually fiction. But a lot of times the line between fiction and nonfiction get blurred. So a lot of the what we would call like the fiction of The Bell Jar was autobiographical. So it was a lot of her life, maybe with some fictionalized details. And to go back to Shooting an Elephant, I just want to backtrack for a second because I did emphasize that that was fiction. Not necessarily. It was, yes, George Orwell was a police officer in Burma during this time that this happened. However, his biographers consider the story Shooting an Elephant as kind of like a rough sketch of something that could happen. There's a little bit of debate there. Yes, he really did shoot an elephant, but I know I'm talking about a story that's not on the agenda today, but I just wanted to backtrack a little bit. Part of it was that, he was so, if you've ever read 1984, it kind of like prefaces the fear to a police state, which is kind of like where, we were discussing that in class. But so much of Shooting an Elephant kind of prefaced that novel that he wrote, that absolutely, you know, critical novel to read and canonized novel, 1984. If you've never read it, read it. I'll just leave it at that. But back to Room 19. There were some wonderful insights, and I will get to Samantha's insight in a minute because I was very impressed by that. Something I never really thought of before, but could have thought of, when I read the story. Goes back to the bell jar reference that I think Alyssa was talking about. This feeling, I mean, let's start at the beginning here. So Susan and Matthew establish a marriage here that is what I called in my assignment question, like the paradigm for a marriage, the perfect marriage, the cookie cutter marriage, right? They did everything they were supposed to do. They called it an intelligent marriage. They were intelligent people. They did everything they were supposed to do. They had their children. Now, the affair that some of you referenced in the discussion forum, the affair that Matthew has is kind of like a, I don't know, Lessing kind of treats it like a trivial thing, like this is just what happens in marriages, and it didn't really seem like it bore much weight in Susan's condition as it progressed throughout the story. It could have been because some of you perceived the story as, that's where her downfall, started happening, was because of the affair. Personally, myself as a reader, I don't think it necessarily was the affair. It could have been some kind of catalyst toward where she was going, where the narrative moved to. But Samantha's perception of the story, or her perspective here, her actual her insight was, about the river. We see the river keeps coming back to us. We keep having a kind of the reader there's always a reference to the river outside by the garden. And as Susan, how can I say, kind of falls apart. Let's just use that word. She's starting to unravel. The river changes for her, the way that she sees it, the way that she perceives it. And then toward the end of the story, as some of you noticed, the for the when the suicide is described, she drifts away into the dark river. The river is brown, the river is dark. It becomes murky at some points. But she seems to have a real, almost like a relationship with the river, as if the river is also a character in the story. My my thoughts on this story. So the marriage is established and the affair happens. She has the kids, and then toward like the middle of the story, Matthew is saying to Susan, "Well, now you'll have time to yourself because the kids will be out of the house." And sure, certainly as a mother, you guys are not mothers, but I don't know what your mothers thought. If your mothers are alive and had other kids, there is for most mothers that sense of like, I love my kids, but just send them to school. Like today, I was just like, just send them to school. I need some time to myself. So that's kind of where Susan thought she was, or where Matthew thought Susan was. Now you don't have the twins, so you'll have all this time to yourself. And she does have that housekeeper in the house, who's kind of like a elusive figure who just sometimes asks for a little less extra, for a duster, or asks for some cleaning product here and there. Not really so much of an overwhelming presence in the story. Although, as Susan begins to perceive her, she becomes more of a kind of this like presence in the story, even though she's kind of just lurking around the periphery. It's just kind of not really in Susan's way so much. But to go back to my perception of the story, I think the main point here is that even after the kids leave and Susan has time to herself, the kids go to school, she has time to herself, she's struggling with this, and somebody used this word, can't remember your name, existential crisis. Okay, so could be. A woman, when, and this can happen to some men too, probably happened to Matthew in some ways, but in marriages, certain roles, especially in the mid 20th century, were played out, and a mother even in the 21st century. Susan had defined herself, or had defined herself in terms of her husband and her children. So she understood herself, her identity, as mother and wife. It's very comforting to understand that you have an identity. And we know that today. And my question is, I throw these questions out. I mean, is it more comforting to know that you have an identity and you can explain it, and you are aware of what it entails? Okay, so she had this identity, and then the kids go off to school. Matthew's working, so Matthew has his identity too. He's the working man of the house, right? He earns the bread, he earns the money. So he has that male masculinity problem going on, that toxic masculinity, where he understands himself as the man who leaves the house every day, makes the money, brings it home to the wife and children. So men and women go through this. But in Susan's case, her unraveling, as I'm going to call it, this kind of unraveling that goes on, there's drumming going downstairs. It happens because she no longer feels that sense of identity. She's wondering. I think it's like an identity crisis. It's like, well, I no longer have to be the mother. I no longer have to be the dutiful wife. Now I have all this time to myself. I have freedom to go off to a room by my. hold on just a second. Let me tell them to stop playing. Guys, I can't focus. Can you? Anyway, sorry about that. Drumming's still going on. So, where was I? So it seems as if Susan wants some kind of freedom, right? It seems as if she wants some kind of freedom. So, does she really need freedom? Is she entrapped in a marriage? Is marriage an entrapment, so to speak? Like, do we understand marriage as an entrapment? Like, you must play this role, you must play this role. Well, their marriage gets a little unorthodox at some points. I mean, the affair happened. Now, Susan is going to this room in this hotel where she rents out and she just sits. Now, some people would use that to their advantage and say, well, I have all this time to myself. I can read, or I can, if she had the freedom to leave the house, you know, go sit at a coffee shop, drink some coffee. Yes, she had the freedom to go out and meet men and have an affair if she wanted to. She didn't want to. And of course, that passage at the end of the story where she contrives a man that she's seeing, just to make up something, to say to her husband, yes, I have been seeing someone. But the main crisis in here, as I said, was an existential one, a crisis of their identity, and the sense of wanting to feel free. So she doesn't even feel captive. It's not just that she feels captive in her situation at home, because once being released from that captivity, she almost feels captivity within herself, within her own understanding of being a woman in the world. This story was written in 1968, somewhere around that time. So similar to that trend going on with women during that time, on the verge of second wave feminism. But that feeling of needing to feel your own sense of agency in the world as a female. And knowing that she had that very, can I say, like, affirmed identity as mother and wife, and then losing that, even though she wanted some freedom from that, losing that, not even knowing who she was anymore. And that's where that captivity came from. And, so the question I had here is, does she feel she had no purpose? Everybody wants to feel like they have purpose. And when you feel like you have no purpose, that is an existential crisis, right? And do we need to have an identity to have purpose, right? Do we need to have something to say, I am, or, I am this, and this is what I stand for, and this is what I do, and my, and how I present myself to the world, makes me feel comfortable, or makes me feel like I am someone, like I exist. Because even when she went to the room 19, there's a line in there where she says, this is the only place I feel like I exist. And I think she was struggling with that kind of like sense of existence, which in traditional literature and theory, the theories of existentialism always applied to just men. But the existential crisis for a woman is very different than it is for a man, because obviously they have played different roles in the world, and established themselves with different identities. So my other question was, is there only freedom in death for her? That's what she probably felt. She was freeing herself from her own captivity within herself, within that feeling of feeling non-existent, or only existent within this room alone. And, this feeling of not feeling at peace. So, I mean, you have to ask yourself, like, how else could she have found herself, or that feeling of I exist, or I mean, I mean, yes, their identity is fluid. We understand ourselves as something at one point in our lives, and then you guys are like college students, so maybe your identity is shifting a little bit in some way or another. But I believe a lot of this story has to do with identity. I'm going to say that one more time. I think Susan, her main crisis or her primary crisis had to do with not understanding what her identity was now that she was technically free of her responsibilities. She was no longer who she was in the marriage with the children. So who am I, right? I mean, she understood herself before the marriage as a working woman in the world, as somebody who spent time alone. To bring in a personal reference, I know for myself, and I'm a writer. My identity with just my husband when I was before our children was very different from when we had our children. I My identity shifted, and I do believe that identities shift throughout our lives. I understand myself now as a mother, as a teacher, educator, and you know, um, that was the problem I think Susan had, is that she just didn't know anymore. I mean, to put it in basic terms, like who she was. And part of that caused that turmoil inside of her. And I'm doing like a psychological analysis of this. But okay, so that kind of covers my notes. But I really did like. I'm going to kind of finish this up because I really did like a lot of your insights on the discussion forum, at least those that I've read so far, and particularly Samantha's. That Samantha, was it C? There's a C and a no, it's the one who wrote about the river. I really thought, she called it foreshadowing. Yeah, Samantha, I think it's like kind of like foreshadowing. It's also like a symbolic, like I said, it's almost like another character in the story. And the person who wrote about the bell jar, if you haven't read the bell jar, read a synopsis, because it's that kind of coming undone, that unraveling, understanding that the kind of this bell jar is coming over your head, and you just want to feel that kind of blank, dark silence, as the river gets darker and darker as the story moves on. And it's just, I'm gonna end this kind of whatever lecture this is, with just saying that, I think it's a story about a woman feeling a sense of loss when she loses her situation, or when the situation shifts or changes. It's kind of like a loss of the self. And what is the self, I think, is the question. Is a woman a self without defining herself in terms of man or in terms of children? What is a woman if not in terms of something else? And that goes back to that binary opposition thing. Without this, you have this. Without that, you have this. Right? So, who is a woman alone? Who is she, and how does she understand herself, without being defining herself in terms of something else? And that's where, I mean, yeah, she could have gone back to work and understood herself as, whatever her occupation was. Maybe that would have helped her in the long run. I mean, if we're talking about like, well, how could have we have taken Susan to therapy and helped her out before what happened? Maybe, her therapist would have encouraged her to go to work, or to take up a hobby, or, do something, because all she did was sit, and she was in her head, in the prison of her mind. That understanding of, and that's also kind of the one who wrote about the bell jar, kind of what happened with Sylvia Plath. Like I said, these stories, to Room 19 was complete fiction, but in response to a lot of the trends that were going on in literature and in literary lives during the time. Sylvia Plath's suicide happened prior to, and Anne Sexton's prior to Room 19, but this was a trend that was like ongoing from the kind of beginning to mid to 20th to starting toward the end of the 20th century. It's, now we understand suicide as a problem. There's suicide hotlines, everybody, but what causes somebody to feel that way? Um, Maybe Susan had too much time alone to think. I don't know. Um, I'm blabbering, so I'm gonna stop. But I just wanted to throw out a few ideas for you, and keep up the discussion forum. I will interject where I can. I'm really enjoying reading your passages on the discussion forum, and I think you guys are thinking really great stuff. This is one of the best courses I think I've ever had the privy of teaching at SUNY Oneonta, because I usually teach creative writing, and you guys have some wonderful insights. I'm assuming you do a lot of reading. That's why you took this course, a lot of you are doing close readings of these stories and really doing a lot of thinking. And I know you're reading them because you are including details from the stories. You're not just skimming and hashing off a bunch of junk to me. So I really appreciate that. Probably the next piece we're reading is an elegy to William Butler Yeats by W.H. Auden. It's short, it's shorter than what you have been reading. It's a longer poem in 3 parts, but wanted to include some poetry. And I am probably going to be recording that lecture tomorrow, so it may be posted tomorrow or early Thursday morning. But that's your next order of business in the class. What's today? Tuesday. So I think tomorrow night, your response paper for to room 19 is due. Do your reading. I'll post the lecture. We're already in the second week of the course, and you're getting 3 credits for this. So this is terrific. I wish it was longer because I'm really, and I wish I had you in person because you guys seem like wonderful writers and readers, and I'm really enjoying it. So I'm going to cut it off there, and I will see you. You will see me soon.